Okay, hello Cloud Gurus and welcome to this lecture. In this lecture we're just going to summarize what we've learnt in the application section of our course. So let's start with SQS, and this is pretty much the most important service that you need to remember going into the exam. So it is worth reading the FAQs on SQS and having a good idea of how SQS works. So SQS is a web service that gives you access to message queues that can be used to store messages while waiting for a computer to process them.
Okay, so let's just recap what SQS is and what it looks like. So we use the example of a user who wants to go on a holiday. Maybe they're using a site like Skyscanner. They submit a request to a fleet of EC2 instances, which is the web application servers. And then basically they then store her request in SQS, where it's stored very safely. This is then polled by another fleet of EC2 instances. Remember that SQS is always pull-based, it's not push-based. And they then take that message, and maybe it's a holiday going to Los Angeles. They then interrogate British Airways websites, Delta's websites, United's websites, etc. To get the best possible deals. Once they've got that information, they then send that back to the web application server, which sends it on back to the user. Now, if that EC2 instance fails for whatever reason, that message will become available back in the SQS queue, and another EC2 instance will go in there and retrieve that message. So my exam tips: remember that SQS is pull-based, it's not push-based. Messages are 256 kilobytes in size. Messages can be kept in the queue from 1 minute all the way through to 14 days, and the default is currently 4 days. The visibility timeout is the amount of time that the message is invisible in the SQS queue after a reader picks up that message. Provided the job is processed before the visibility timeout expires, the message will then be deleted from the queue. However, if the job is not processed within that time, the message will become visible again and another reader will process it. This could result in the same message being delivered twice. So it all comes down to the visibility timeout. Is that time going to be greater than the amount of time that the EC2 instance is going to take to process the job? If so, you're fine. If not, you're going to result in the message being delivered twice. And then the visibility timeout maximum is 12 hours. So if you've got jobs that are going over 12 hours, SQS is not a good solution for you. SQS guarantees that your messages will be processed at least once, and then SQS long polling is a way to retrieve messages from your SQS queues. So when you're doing short polling, which is the default, basically it's going to get a result immediately. So your EC2 instance is sitting there saying, have you got work for me? Have you got work for me? Have you got work for me? And that's costing you money. Long polling will basically sets a thing. So if the EC2 instance goes and says, have you got work for me? It won't respond unless there is work for it until the long poll times out. So it means that your EC2 instances aren't querying your SQS queues as quickly. Queues can also either be standard or first in, first out. Standard is the default. First in, first out means that the messages are ordered. Standard, they try and keep them, the messages ordered, but there's no guarantee of it, whereas with FIFO there is. So that is it for SQS.
Moving on to simple workflow service, and really where you're going to be tested on this is two areas. One is comparing it to SQS. So SQS has a retention period of 14 days, whereas simple workflow service has a retention period for up to a year for workflow executions. Simple workflow service presents a task-orientated API, whereas SQS is a message-orientated API. So again, just remember that example I gave you with simple workflow service where humans can be involved, and Amazon really do use simple workflow service to fulfill orders. So when you place an order on Amazon.com, this is using SWF, as a means of managing that order and getting somebody to go and find that hammer in that warehouse and then deliver it to the packing area, etc., etc. And also remember that simple workflow service ensures that a task is assigned only once and is never duplicated. With SQS, you need to be able to handle duplicate messages, and and may also need to ensure that a message is processed only once. Simple Workflow Service also keeps tracks of all tasks and event in an application, whereas SQS, you need to implement your own application level tracking, especially if your application uses multiple queues. The other important thing to remember about Simple Workflow Service is just the 3 different types of actors. You might be asked to identify these different types of actors in a multiple choice questions. You have to choose 3 out of 4. So the first one is always a workflow starter, and this is an application that can initiate or start a workflow. It could be your e-commerce website when placing an order or a mobile app when searching for a bus time, for example. Then we have our deciders, and they're basically controlling the flow of activity tasks in a workflow execution. So, did the person's credit card details go through? Have they selected the right address? Is this a verified address? If it's not a verified address, then do this. Think of a workflow decider as basically an if-then, decider in your application logic. So if something has finished in a workflow or fails, the decider is going to decide what to do next. We then have our activity workers, and they actually go in and carry out the activity task. And these could be humans. This could be the guy in the warehouse going to go find that hammer. It doesn't have to be EC2 instances or scripts that you're running. So remember those 3 different types of actors going into the exam. Moving on to SNS, the key thing to remember are the different types of subscribers. So I could say protocols, but not all of these are protocols. So it's like HTTP, you can have HTTPS, you can send out SNS messages through email with JSON, you can send it into an SQS queue, you can send it to your applications, and you can even use it to trigger a Lambda function. So remember, in the lab, we created a topic, and then we added subscribers to the topic, and then we choose what those subscribers were by selecting the protocol. So you should know these different protocols going into the exam, because you may be asked in a multiple choice question to choose the 3 protocols that SNS supports. So just remember those going into the exam. The other thing you should realize is the difference between SNS versus SQS. Again, they like to compare SQS with every other application service, though technically SNS is now a mobile service, not an application service. But the exam will ask you to compare the 2. So remember that they're both messaging services in AWS. SNS is a push-based system, so when you send something to a topic, it's pushed out, it goes to SQS, it goes to your HTTP endpoints, it goes to your email, it goes to your phone, whereas a SQS polls, so a message sits in the SQS queue, and you've got to have like an EC2 instance pulling the data down. So that's the difference. SNS is push, SQS is basically a pull service. And then finally, Elastic Transcoder, we covered it off. It's a media transcoder in the cloud. It allows you to convert media files from their original source format into different formats that will play on smartphones, tablets, PCs, etc. It provides transcoding presets for popular output formats, which means that you don't have to guess about which setting works best for a particular device. And the way you pay for it is based on the minutes that you spend transcoding and the resolution at which you transcode. And I gave the example, we at A Cloud Guru use this all the time when we are uploading new videos to our site.
And then finally, to wrap this section up, you need to understand the core Kinesis services. So we have Kinesis Streams, we have Kinesis Firehose, and we have Kinesis Analytics. So what is Kinesis Streams? Well, we've got our data producers. So these are things like EC2 instances, our mobile phones, our laptops, could be IoT. They're sending a whole bunch of data to our Kinesis Streams. These streams are split into shards, and then those shards basically pipe the data to our data consumers, which will be a fleet of EC2 instances. So you have to think about it from an architectural point of view. If the scenario question is asking you about sharding in terms of Kinesis, it's always going to be Kinesis Streams. And then our EC2 instances can then store the data in a whole bunch of different services. So it could be S3, DynamoDB, Elastic MapReduce, Redshift, etc. Kinesis Firehose, so we have our data producers. They're sending the data to Firehose, and basically Firehose won't hold that data. It's going to, you can basically query the data using Lambda functions, and then Firehose just sends it straight onto S3. So you don't have to worry about shards or anything like that. You can have Lambda sitting there querying your functions, but that's it. So if you see shards, think streams. If you are not doing that, if you're just querying it using Lambda, think of Kinesis Firehose. And then finally, Kinesis Analytics just sits on top, allows you to do SQL queries to both Kinesis streams and to Kinesis Firehose. And then you can store that data in S3 into Redshift or into an Elasticsearch cluster. So my exam tips, definitely make sure you know the difference between Kinesis streams and Kinesis Firehose. You're going to give them a whole bunch of different scenario questions. So you must choose the most relevant service and then understand that Kinesis Analytics sits on top of that. Okay, so that's it for this lecture, guys, and that's it for this section. If you have any questions, please let me know. If not, feel free to move on to the next section. Thank you.